Those of us who aren't twins have no idea what that type of connection is like. People often talk about twin telepathy, a particularly intense psychological bond between twins that thoroughly outstrips that of non-twin siblings. However, the relationship between June and Jennifer Gibbons was unusually ferocious, even by twin standards, to the point of being rather eerie. However, it was a relationship that the twins were quite arguably driven into, due to the outside prejudices they faced as a result of their race and speech impediment. For many years, these two twins refused to speak to anyone besides each other, earning the moniker of the Silent Twins, and that's only the tip of the iceberg in this very odd tale. This is the story of June and Jennifer Gibbons. June and Jennifer Gibbons were born on April 11, 1963, on a Royal Air Base in Yemen, where their father was stationed at the time. From birth, the dynamic that would become more obvious later in their lives was already present. Although June was born first, when Jennifer arrived 10 minutes later, she was clearly the stronger of the two, more alert, louder, and more physically robust. The twins' parents were from Barbados, but their father, a lifelong Anglophile, moved the family to the UK not long after the twins' birth. During this period, a great number of Afro-Caribbean people living in former British colonies relocated to the UK in order to fill shortages in the labor market, in what became known as the Windrush generation. The Gibbons family, which consisted of the twins, their two parents, Gloria and Aubrey, and their two older siblings, Greta and David, first moved to England, specifically Yorkshire. Aubrey and Gloria had envisioned leading a specific type of life after their move to Britain. They imagined their family leading what they thought of as a typical British life, which seemed to greatly resemble the mid-20th century American dream, with a nice house and a white picket fence, just with added appreciation for the Queen and cricket. They found, however, that this dream life was harder to attain than they thought it would be. Sadly, and unsurprisingly, the family faced xenophobia and racism in their new country, and both Aubrey and Gloria ended up moving from job to job semi-regularly. They kept pushing forward, however, and in 1967, the couple's fifth child, Rosie, was born. From a young age, the twins had issues with communication. By the age 3 or 4, they still could barely speak, only saying a few words at a time. According to Aubrey, the twins would talk and make sounds at home, but they still didn't speak like average children at that age. And when they did speak, they had a speech impediment that made them relatively difficult to understand. When the twins were 8 years old, the family moved to the town of Chivener, and the twins started attending a new school, where they faced racist bullying even worse than they had before. As June later told reporter Marjorie Wallace, "People called us names. We were the only black girls in school. Terrible names. They pulled our hair." While the twins had never spoken as much as normal kids their age, it was around this time that they made a pact to stop talking altogether to anyone besides each other, in large part due to their frustration with people having a difficult time understanding them. This included their own family, who were some of the only people they spoke in front of with any sort of regularity. According to June, "We said we weren't going to speak to anybody. We stopped talking altogether. Only us two, in our bedroom upstairs." Occasionally, their parents would overhear the twins talking in their bedroom. However, they were unable to understand what the twins were talking about, as they were speaking a strange language that Aubrey and Gloria didn't understand, and that, as far as anyone was aware at the time, wasn't a known language at all. In 1974, after moving to Wales, the bullying and prejudice the girls had faced in England continued. Unfortunately, this was rather unsurprising, as the twins and their siblings were the only black children in their school. As June stated in the documentary Silent Twins, Without My Shadow, they kept saying, "Why won't they speak? Can they speak English? Why don't they talk?" And the more they said that, the more we shut up. It seems, from the way that June describes things, that the twins' frustration with others being seemingly unable to understand them when they attempted to communicate is what drove the twins to purposefully only talk to each other. the only other person in the world that they could rely on to understand them. While this is in a way understandable, given the twins' unfortunate circumstances, it's not surprising that speaking to one other person tends to breed an incredibly unhealthy relationship dynamic with that person, with them being the only true outlet into the world outside of your own head. As we'll see, the relationship dynamic between June and Jennifer that would blossom out of this decision to only speak with each other was incredibly toxic and codependent, to say the least. The twins' odd behavior was first taken notice of by an adult in 1976 at a tuberculosis vaccination session. The doctor responsible for giving the vaccine stated, "The twins were totally expressionless. You spoke to them, they didn't react, they didn't look at you. 13-year-olds tear about the place. Now these two little girls were walking, one behind the other, heads down, as if they're in some sort of chain gang. I'd never come across anything like it before." This doctor reported his concerns to the school, and the twins were subsequently assessed by a child psychologist who diagnosed them as elective mutes. The girls were then referred to Anne Treharne, the chief speech therapist at the Withybush Hospital in Haverfordwest, in February of 1977. Although June and Jennifer almost always refused to speak in front of Anne, they agreed to read out loud while being recorded when she had left the room. From listening to these tapes, Anne discovered that the secret language the twins spoke was, in reality, English, or more specifically, English mixed with Barbados slang and spoken very quickly. This, combined with the girls' West Indian accents and their speech impediment, rendered their speech difficult for anyone besides each other to understand. Still, it's heartbreaking to think that it took this long, until the girls were 14 years old, for anyone to make any true attempt at understanding them. Anne also noticed that there seemed to be a power imbalance between the girls. Sometimes, Anne thought that June wanted to speak to her, but that Jennifer stopped her using eye signals, in a manner that appeared to Anne as if Jennifer was controlling June's actions. In an interview with Wallace, Anne stated, "The thought entered my mind that June was possessed by her twin." This was a sentiment that would later be echoed by the reporter, Marjorie Wallace, who also reported that she felt as though Jennifer was the more dominant of the twins, to the point that she took some level of control over June's actions. Later, in 1977, the girls were transferred to Eastgate Center for Special Education. Their teacher was a woman named Kathy Arthur, who worked with the girls to help make their speech clearer, although the real challenge was still coaxing them to speak at all to anyone besides each other. At this point, the girls were clearly both using each other as a crutch, largely unable or unwilling to speak to anyone besides the other, as they had grown so accustomed to speaking only with their own shadow, someone who could understand them effortlessly. Eventually, June wrote a letter to Kathy stating, "It would be a good idea if we separate. I think one should go, and one should stay here. We act stupid when we're together. Some people think we don't want to separate, but we want to, because it really is the best thing for us." Jennifer also wrote a letter to Kathy, expressing a similar sentiment, which read, "It would be good if we separate. We both fight for the best things. We are both willing to lead our own lives, but when we are together, we just keep depending on each other too much." Cautiously optimistic that the girls seemed willing to leave their comfort zone, the school gave them an ultimatum. The twins would decide which one of them would leave. However, this cautious optimism quickly came to a screeching halt, as this ultimatum caused a huge fight between the twins. In an enormous public outburst unlike anything anyone had ever seen out of them, the twins shouted and screamed at each other, fighting over the decision, who should stay and who would go. Eventually, it was decided that June would be sent away to another boarding school. However, once separated, the twins both entered what can only be described as a catatonic state. June apparently had a complete breakdown. She would sit on her bed without moving for hours on end, wouldn't eat, wouldn't go to the bathroom, and seemingly wouldn't sleep. This, of course, led to the end of the separation experiment. Perhaps it was too late for the girls to be meaningfully separated in any way. They had simply spent too much time in their own little world of two, depending entirely on each other. Indeed, the boundaries separating one twin from the other What made them two individuals rather than one being in two bodies seemed to be blurring for the twins, as discussed by June herself in the documentary Silent Twins, where she stated, "One day, she'd wake up and be me, and one day I would wake up and be her, and we used to say to each other, 'Give me back myself. If you give me back myself, I'll give you back yourself.'" In 1979, at the age of 16, the girls left Eastgate. They returned to their parents' home, although they still didn't speak to their family members. For the next 2 years, they would try to find a way out of their self-imposed silence, including taking a course called The Art of Conversation that was meant to teach how to communicate effectively with others. This attempt, however, failed. So the girls instead decided they would communicate with the world in another way, through writing books. What the girls were unable to do verbally, they were incredibly proficient at doing through the written word, communicating their thoughts, feelings, frustrations, ideas, and dreams, as proven by their verbose diary entries. June wrote a book called Pepsi Cola Addict, about a high schooler who was seduced by a teacher and sent away to reformatory school where a guard also attempts to seduce him. The girls used their unemployment benefits to get the book published by a vanity press, a publishing house where authors pay to have their books published. Jennifer wrote a book entitled The Pugilist, in which a physician kills the family dog in order to obtain a heart for his child's heart transplant. The spirit of the dog, living on inside the child, ultimately gets its revenge against the father. Jennifer's other works included Discomania, about a young woman who discovers that the local disco incites patrons to insane violence, a radio play called Postman and Postwoman, and several other short stories. The girls' attempts to get any of their other works published, besides Pepsi Cola Addict, were sadly unsuccessful. After about 2 years of this, sitting in their childhood bedroom, writing, not talking to anyone besides each other, the girls would finally venture out into the outside world in 1981. Now 21 years old, they decided to search for an American boy that they had met and become fascinated with during their time at Eastgate. When they eventually located his family, the boy, whose name was Lance Kennedy, had already moved to Philadelphia. However, the girls quickly fell in with Lance's 3 brothers, Jerry, Wayne, and Carl. These boys introduced the twins to the world of sex, drugs, and alcohol, and the twins discovered that alcohol, as it does for many people, helped to loosen their tongues. Said June, "Without the whiskey, we didn't speak. We reckoned that God told us to buy a drink, and it worked. We sniffed glue and lighter fluid. We were different then, laughing and talking. We were so relaxed and laid back." Although the Kennedy brothers reportedly did not treat the twins very well, often ignoring or insulting them, the girls both wanted attention from these boys, the first people that they had meaningful communication with besides each other in many, many years. Despite this, the boundaries between the twins were still tenuous. One night, the twins and one of the boys, Carl, got drunk in a church, and Jennifer lost her virginity to Carl while June watched. This experience caused June a lot of pain and anxiety, ramping up the tension and fear that had been growing between the twins. She wrote, "Something like magic is happening. I am seeing Jennifer for the first time like she is seeing me. I think she is slow, cold, has no respect, and talks too much, but she thinks I am the same. We are both holding each other back. There is a murderous gleam in her eye. Dear Lord, I am scared of her. She is not normal. She is having a nervous breakdown. Someone is driving her insane. It is me." 2 weeks later, June lost her own virginity to one of the Kennedy boys in much the same way that her sister had. Soon, the relationship between the twins began to turn violent once again. Jennifer wrote in her diary, "I'm not ashamed to say I tried to kill my sister. Things got out of hand. I did not succeed in strangling her with the wire to the radio. I'm sure she wanted to kill me too. I had a grave feeling she did." At one point during the summer, June pushed Jennifer down in a river and attempted to drown her. However, despite these tensions, and despite the Kennedy brothers' poor treatment of them, the girls felt that this was the best summer they had ever had, with June describing that summer as 5 weeks of fun. For once, they were making their own decisions, and they were happy, beginning to enjoy themselves. However, this fun was short-lived, as the Kennedy family moved back to the US at the end of the summer. In the fall of 1981, with no one else around to focus on, the twins began to take their pent-up frustrations and aggression out on themselves. Spending all of their money on food, they began an unhealthy habit of binging and purging. Their diaries, again, offer insights on where the twins' minds were at during this time. Jennifer wrote, "I will gain control over my mind, my body. I must be at peace with myself. I will want death if I have no peace. And who will cry at my funeral? Teenager dies from diet, binge, life." From June's diary around the same time, she wrote, "I loathe food which destroys my soul, my face, my body. Yet I go on eating out of duty, out of weariness. I bite into the body of my very enemy, and as I chew my food will win. It can take dominion over my flesh, making me corrupt and depraved, exposing me to a plumpness of flesh, a fattening of the heart, over healthy, rarely satisfied." Clearly not in the healthiest mindset to begin with. Once again, only having each other for company served to further break down their fragile mental state. Their curious, intense attachment to each other had grown, or rather deteriorated, into what can at best be called a love-hate relationship, one in which they simultaneously detested each other, their similarities, their differences, and yet found it impossible to split away from each other. A sentiment once again found poetically expressed in their diaries. "Jennifer and I are like lovers," June wrote. "She thinks I am weak. She knows not how I fear her. This makes me feel more weak. I want to be strong enough to split from her. Oh Lord, help me. I am in despair." Jennifer wrote, "She should have died at birth. Cain killed Abel. No twin should forget that." June, "I'm in enslavement to her, this creature, who is with me every hour of my living soul." Jennifer, "June can't be my real twin. My real twin was born at the exact time as me, has my rising sign, my looks, my ways, my dreams, my ambitions. He or she will have my weaknesses, failures, opinions. All this makes a twin, no differences. I can't stand differences." Once the self-harm they inflicted upon themselves via their unhealthy eating habits stopped being enough, the twins began to direct their built-up hatred at the world around them. They attempted to join a local gang, although this effort failed. Undeterred, the two began a life of crime on their own. They started stealing bicycles, broke into a training center and a school, smashed windows, drew graffiti, tried to break a payphone, and called the police to confess their crimes before hanging up and running away before the police got there. As tends to happen, the twins' crimes started to escalate over time. June wrote in her diary about her plans to make petrol bombs and hurl them through windows, with the declaration, "I'm going to be the biggest arsonist around." On October 24th, 1981, the twins fulfilled this fantasy. They broke into and burned down a tractor store, an event that June summarized in her diary with the following. "All this week I've wanted to burn down the tractor store in Snowdrop Lane. I burned it down today, with the help of Jennifer, of course. It was the biggest night of my life. We climbed over a barbed wire fence. The sky grew blacker and it started to rain. All the while, my lovely, glorious fire was licking its way through the roof, and the thick smoke filled the night sky. It was a picture which will live in my mind forever. Oh, what a sinful, evil, selfish mind. I know the Lord will forgive me. It's been a long, painful, hard year. Don't I deserve to express my distress?" With their leap from petty crime to actual dangerous crime, the twins continued down this path by attempting to set a second fire on November 8th. At Pembroke Technical College. However, their life of crime would soon be cut short. They smashed a window to break into the college, but a policeman on patrol heard them, called for backup, and caught them just as they were about to light the fire. The twins were arrested, and when their room was searched, their diaries, filled with stories of their crimes, were discovered, providing irrefutable evidence that they were not just guilty of attempting to light Pembroke on fire, but of multiple other crimes as well. The twins were sent to the Pucklechook Remand Center, 10 miles from Bristol, where they remained for 7 months while the judicial system tried to decide what to do with them. At this point, the twins found life unbearable together and unbearable apart. During their time at Pucklechook, they shared a cell, but fought often and were separated. Once separated, they were distressed and were then reunited, only for the cycle to continue. They returned to silence, once again refusing to talk to anyone besides each other, which of course made life difficult for the lawyers and doctors assigned to them. According to Dr. William Spry, one of their doctors, the twins eventually were convinced to talk a little over the telephone. From June's diary, we talked to the doctor about life. Jennifer told him about how she hears voices, sees visions, and wants to kill me. I told him about how sensitive I am, how I pick up people's moods, have dreams and visions. He's puzzled with our non-communication with my parents. Haven't spoken sensibly to them since the beginning of my teenage years. I said it was a habit. He wasn't impressed. He thought we were perfectly capable of talking, but I said I'm too withdrawn. Jennifer is more withdrawn than me. She needs more help. I told him I'd like to kill her. I would strangle her. She told him how we attempted to drown each other in the river. I said that only one of us should have been born. Life would have been smoother. Dr. Spry believed that the twins' behavior signified the beginning stages of schizophrenia. The Institute came to the conclusion that the twins were dangerous, both to themselves and to society at large. Dr. Spry believed that they were in need of medical treatment, not prison. However, the only place they could receive the treatment that the state had decided they needed was in a secure environment. The twins, who had been persuaded that institutionalization would solve their problems, pled guilty to their crimes and were sentenced indefinitely to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security mental health facility. The reality of Broadmoor Hospital was not what June and Jennifer had anticipated. It was overcrowded for one. The twins were kept in separate wards, and now with an official schizophrenia diagnosis, the twins were given tranquilizers alongside other drugs. A few years passed, then a few more, and the twins still weren't released from Broadmoor, with the doctors who reviewed their cases always deciding that they needed a few more years of treatment. Eventually, out of desperation, the girls broke their code of silence, essentially telling the doctor, "Look, you wanted us to talk, we're talking now," in the hopes that breaking their silence would be the key to their release. The doctor, however, once again rejected them, telling the twins that they would be there for 30 years. With little to no economic or social power to back them up, the twins were effectively trapped at Broadmoor, with no real way out. Although Aubrey and Gloria had trusted the British system to do what was best for their daughters, after the twins were sent to Broadmoor, the reality of their daughter's dire situation began to set in. In the documentary Silent Twins, Without My Shadow, Aubrey was clearly upset at his daughter's imprisonment, at the way they were spending their early adult years, and at the difficulty of visiting them and having to see them in that situation. Gloria outright stated that she did not believe the twins were, quote, really mental, unquote, that they had merely faced difficulties over not being able to speak or be understood for much of their lives. She cited the letters that the twins wrote to her, as well as to each other, while at Broadmoor as proof that the twins weren't really mental, saying, "No mental person could have written those." Indeed, the twins' letters to their parents and to each other during their confinement were just as well written and lyrical as their diary entries had been. In a way, the twins' writing throws into sharp relief the true tragedy of their situation. Though assumed to be of lower intelligence or not able to fully understand English for much of their lives due to their speech impediments and their subsequent silence, their writing makes it clear that not only did the twins have a perfect grasp of the English language, but they were actually wildly intelligent and excellent writers to boot. One of these letters, written by Jennifer to June while at Broadmoor, read, "My dear June, I agree a lot with you about we two being old spinsters left on the shelf, 'cause to be honest, I've had enough of men. Any relationship always ends for me. I can do without them. You are my only relationship. I know I'll die young and way before you, and it really doesn't matter. I only hope you'll be happy still." This ended up being an eerie premonition of Jennifer's ultimate fate. Over the years, the twins and their story had drawn the attention of reporter Marjorie Wallace. She was able to gain access to June and Jennifer's diaries after winning Aubrey and Gloria's confidence, and was shocked by the sheer quality of the writings that she found there. And, moreover, she found nothing that suggested that the girls were psychopathic, merely misunderstood and mistreated. She quickly became their biggest and most vocal advocate, almost single-handedly making the silent twins into a cause célèbre in Britain. Through Marjorie's writings and interviews with the twins, they became symbols of the incompetence, cruelty, and unfairness of the English justice system, especially for those like June and Jennifer, who were in many ways outsiders. It's very possible that the attention Wallace brought to the case played a big role in why June and Jennifer were eventually released from Broadmoor, rather than languishing there for the 30 years that the doctor had spitefully promised them. In March 1993, after 11 years at Broadmoor, the twins finally received permission to transfer to Caswell Clinic, a medium-security institution in Wales. The day before their transfer, however, Jennifer didn't feel well. She complained that she felt weak and tired. When they arrived at Caswell the next day, March 9th, 1993, Jennifer, who had drifted off to sleep in June's lap on the way over, couldn't be woken. She was taken to the hospital, where she died shortly thereafter of acute myocarditis, or sudden inflammation of the heart. This rare disorder isn't often fatal, and there were no drugs or alcohol to be found in her system, making her sudden death incredibly odd, to say the least. Jennifer was mere days shy of 30 at the time, young enough that a random heart condition occurring would be considered unusual. Jennifer was buried in St. Martin's Cemetery in Haverfordwest, Wales, with a headstone that read, "We once were two. We two made one. We no more two. Through life be one." There was never a true explanation put forth for Jennifer's sudden death, other than it being a freak accident. Marjorie Wallace, the reporter who cast so much light on the twins and their story, is the only one who was able to provide any insight on Jennifer's death, though her revelations really only serve to make the true medical cause of Jennifer's death more confusing. A few days before the twins were set to finally move out of Broadmoor, Marjorie Wallace visited them, as had become a habit for her every weekend. In an interview with NPR, Wallace described the conversation she had with Jennifer that day, saying, "We had quite a jolly conversation to begin with, and then suddenly, in the middle of the conversation, Jennifer said, 'Marjorie, I'm going to have to die.' And I sort of laughed. I sort of said, 'What? Don't be silly. You know, you're just about to be freed from Broadmoor. Why are you going to have to die? You're not ill.' And she said, 'Because we've decided.' At that point, I got very, very frightened because I could see that they meant it." It seems, Wallace said, that the twins had come to the conclusion that one of them had to die in order for the other to live a happy and fulfilling life. A sacrifice, in a way, and that they had been preparing for this to happen for some time. Now again, this doesn't provide any sort of medical explanation for why Jennifer dropped dead out of nowhere, as there were no drugs found in her system and no other clear cause behind the sudden inflammation of her heart. But if Jennifer's death was indeed simply a freak accident, it's certainly uncanny that it came so closely after this conversation with Marjorie Wallace. Following Jennifer's death, Wallace visited June to see how she was doing. June echoed similar statements to those that her twin had made mere days before her death, saying that she and Jennifer had agreed that Jennifer had to die, and that once she did it, it would be June's responsibility to live freely for the both of them. Whether or not the twins' statements and beliefs regarding Jennifer's death were actually true, it is clear that, following Jennifer's death, June opened up in ways that she never had before. Wallace described June as being in good spirits, and being generally willing to sit and talk like she never had before. June remained at the Caswell Clinic for some time, and it quickly became apparent that while she was of course deeply upset by her twin's death, that it had also, in a way, brought her the freedom that Jennifer and June had believed it would. Freedom from their intense, unhealthy, codependent relationship. Only just over a year later, June's condition had improved enough that she was released on parole. On the day of her release, after expressing excitement about her impending freedom, she told the crew of the Silent Twins documentary, "I feel like I'm living for her. I think that's what she would have wanted, for me to go on living for her. Every day I wake up and say to myself, well, it's one more day for me, but one more day for my sister as well. I live for her, and what I see and do, she does as well. Am I lucky or something, to still be alive while she's gone? I thought I'd never get over her death, but it's made me 10 times stronger." June was released, first into a halfway house, but she was able to move into her own apartment relatively quickly. Since then, it appears that she's led a completely normal life. She still lives in the UK, not far from her family, and is more than willing to speak with anyone who wishes to speak with her, if the pact that she and Jennifer made was indeed true. June at least is certainly holding up her end of the bargain, to live a fulfilling life on behalf of the both of them. The story of the Silent Twins, June and Jennifer Gibbons, is less of a scary crime story, and more of a tragic, heartbreaking story of two girls who were left behind by the system, due to a mixture of their race and their speech impediment, and as a result were forced to retreat into a world where they only really had each other to rely on, which is an unhealthy relationship dynamic for anyone, let alone two young girls facing a staggering amount of racism and prejudice. Some may look at the story of the Silent Twins and come away with the feeling that this is, in some ways, a supernatural tale. Twins, after all, are often associated with the supernatural, whether that be in horror stories like the creepy twins in Stephen King's The Shining, or just the common belief that twins have some sort of telepathy with each other. The toxic hyperdependence that June and Jennifer grew to have, in addition to Jennifer's mysterious death, and the statements made by both twins about Jennifer's death being in some way a sacrifice for June to live a more complete and fulfilling life, certainly don't help in that regard. However, at the end of the day, most of June and Jennifer's story can be explained by the simple fact that the girls were misunderstood and mistreated for a large portion of their lives. And the hyper-dependence on each other that grew out of that social isolation was simply such a strong force in their lives that, sadly, only death could sever it. No one, besides the twins themselves, will ever truly know what exactly the bond between June and Jennifer Gibbons, the Silent Twins, was like. And moreover, it seems that we'll sadly never truly know what caused Jennifer's death, besides perhaps Marjorie Wallace's explanation that she willed herself to die so that her twin could finally be free. The story of June and Jennifer Gibbons remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. Research and writing for this episode was done by Olivia Paradice. Production for this episode was carried out by me, your host, Micheal Whelan. The music for this episode was also composed by myself through Amper Music, except for the song you're hearing now, the Unresolved theme song, which was written and composed by Ailsa Traves. To get a full list of sources and references for this episode, you can check out the podcast website at unresolved.me. There, each story I cover has its own page, where you can follow along with a transcript or find our sources and additional research links. Once again, that's unresolved.me. If you would like to help support this podcast and gain access to our archive of exclusive digital content, such as a recent episode that details a bizarre double murder from South Carolina, please head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod or search for Unresolved Pod in the Patreon app. Now, I would like to take a minute to thank the amazing producers of this podcast who support this show each month on Patreon. These amazing supporters are Roberta Jansen, Travis Sepko, Ben Crocum, Quill Carter, Stephen Wilson, Laura Hannon, Joe Wong, Damian Moore, Scott Nisi, Marie Vengland, Scott Patzold, Astrid Nair, Jaime McGregor, Sarah Moscaritolo, Sydney Scotton, Thomas Ahern, Marion Welsh, Patrick Loxo, Meadow Landry, Tatum Bautista, Denise Grogan, Tunya Elzinga, Sally Ranford, James Harrington, Ryan Green, Rebecca O'Sullivan, Jacinta Class, Stephanie Joyner, James Weiss, Kevin McCracken, Brooke Bullock, Lauren Nicole, Matthew Dreywick, Sarah Rosario, and Stacy Hauser. Thank you all so much, and thank you to everyone that has recently left us reviews on Apple Podcast or other podcast apps. Those really do go a long way to help support the show and are always appreciated, as is your continued patronage. Until next time, I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and get vaccinated. I will talk to you later.